Hey guys, and welcome back to We No Wonder. So today I'm going to be doing an episode of Philip that I've been excited to film for a really long time. Today we're going to be talking about Noli Me Tangere by Jose Rizal. So for those of you guys who may not be familiar with Noli Me Tangere, it's a pretty big novel in the Philippine literary canon. It's something that's taught to us in high school, and it's something that we discuss in college as well for some of our basic courses. Noli Me Tangere is often described as the book or like the novel which sparked the Philippine Revolution. The reason for that is that Jose Rizal was an ilustrado. So he was one of the few Filipinos who was privileged to sort of study abroad and be sponsored by the Spanish government. So if you were an ilustrado back then, you had a pretty good position in society. And at the time, most of the people who were campaigning for emancipation from the Spanish government were people from the lower classes. And so it was a real big thing for Jose Rizal to write a book like this. The leader of the Katipunan, or the resistance, was named Andres Bonifacio, and a big part of why this book became super controversial and why it was banned in the Philippines when it was first published is because the Katipunan sort of clung to this as a source text, or kind of as a text to move the resistance forward. So what is this book about? This book is about Crisostomo Ibarra, who is a lot like Rizal. Like, I think Rizal definitely did a lot of autobiographical projection here, because Crisostomo Ibarra, like Rizal, was also an ilustrado, and the book starts when he comes home from Spain to find that his dad has died, and that his dad has died under questionable circumstances. So when he kind of digs that up, he sort of stumbles upon a bunch of very tricky situations where he's forced to address not just the position of Filipino people in general, but also his position as someone who is sort of in between. I'd say that the thing that this book does really, really well is sort of shed light on that gray area where Crisostomo Ibarra does definitely have a lot of advantages that are given to him because of his privilege in society, because he was educated by Spanish standards, but it also puts him in a difficult place because he sees the different abuses that the Spanish are sort of inflicting on regular Filipinos. And of course, it's very, very dramatic as well. I think that Philippine culture definitely borrows from Spanish culture a lot when it comes to melodrama, and when it comes to stuff like just who's the real father of so-and-so and who is the actual person who so-and-so is engaged to. It's very fun to read because of that. The only thing that I will say is that this edition, which is a Penguin Classics edition, is in English. When I originally read this as a teenager, I read the edition that was in Filipino or in Tagalog, and I really enjoyed that one more. It was a lot easier to get through, and I feel like the language flowed better. And I think I mentioned this before, I think that's probably to do with the way that Tagalog and Spanish are structured a little bit more similarly than Spanish and English are structured. This was a rough translation, like absolutely no shade to the guy who translated this, but it was so hard to get through, and a lot of the jokes just fell flat. And there were just so many moments in this when I'm like, why would you bother? Like, there are parts in this where suddenly stuff is quoted in Tagalog and stuff is quoted in Spanish, and I'm like, you already bothered to translate a big part of this, so why would you quote this? It didn't make sense to me, those bits. But that said, I think that if you are an English speaker and you can't read this in Tagalog or in Spanish, I think it's still worth picking it up. One of the things that I really, really like about this is the way that Rizal uses different story arcs and sort of uses small, thin chapters to push the narrative forward. I feel like if this was written in a style that was more immersive, or in a style where the chapters were longer, it wouldn't really work. I like how it sort of functions almost like a play, even, where every little chapter is kind of just one scene, and that one scene sort of lends to this bigger story arc. I really enjoyed the structure of this book. Another interesting thing about this is that I think I was talking about this before, where Jose Rizal being our national hero was kind of a political choice that was set upon us by the Americans, because the States basically bought the Philippines from Spain, and they even staged this whole war. Read about the Treaty of Paris, because they staged this whole like Spanish-American war, but the truth is that they had already sold the Philippines to the US. So the Americans chose Jose Rizal to be our national hero because they thought that he was the safer choice. Like, the other person who was in the running was Andres Bonifacio, and Andres Bonifacio was a revolutionary. He was, you know, the kind of guy who kind of led people through these revolts and stuff. So I think that they really didn't want that to be sort of the person that they put up on that pedestal. And the thing that I find really interesting is, if you look at modern day middle-class Filipinos, I feel like we've all kind of adopted the way that Jose Rizal was, or I guess if we're looking at this book, the way that Crisostomo Ibarra was, just because, number one, we're all sort of foreign educated in a way. Most schools use English as the medium of instruction. We read our literature mostly in English. The movies that are shown in our theaters are mostly American movies, and just all of this stuff, and that benefits us in a way. Like, I think the Philippines has a pretty good employment rate, at least for the middle class, and I think that there are lots of opportunities, especially abroad, for us, and it's always used by families as sort of a status symbol for success if their kid is able to go abroad and study abroad or work abroad. And that's also kind of the way that it was in Rizal's time. That's kind of what this book talks about as well. Yes, it's sort of an achievement to be able to do that, but what does it mean? Like, how does that translate to something that's going to be able to help your countrymen and help people sort of in the bigger scheme of things? And I just think that it's such a funny book. It's such a cleverly written book, and it's super sarcastic. I also want to talk about the characters in this book, because there's so many more interesting characters than Crisostomo Ibarra. So first I want to talk about Sisa. Sisa is a woman who is living in the province, and she has 2 young sons. She's married to a deadbeat guy, and basically her kids are the breadwinners because her kids are boys. Their names are Crispin and Basilio, and they go to work as sacristans or altar boys, and they're basically heavily abused by the priests. But of course Sisa doesn't know that, and she sort of spirals into madness when she catches a glimpse of the things that are done to her kids. And I find her character very interesting, because she's kind of the character that pushes everyone forward. She's the character that pushes all of these other characters who have bigger influences on society into action. I was just always rooting for her, even if I knew that things probably wouldn't turn out very well for her. Another one of my favorite characters in this is Pilosopong Tasio. I think in this translation he's called Tasio the Philosopher, and he's just this really smart guy. He's basically a guy who is super liberal and doesn't quite belong in his time. I find the things that he says very interesting because they're super duper subversive, especially when it comes to talking about the church. One of the main conflicts in this book has to do with the separation of church and state. The Philippines is a Catholic country, and we get most of that Catholicism, if not all of it, from Spain. So back then I think things were a little bit worse because the Catholic Church just had such a big influence on what the government did and the way that society ran. Pilosopong Tasio, every time he says something, I'm just like, yes, boy, slay. Because he just presents a really good voice of reason for all of the drama that goes on in this book. And I think that's all that I really have to say about Noli Me Tangere. I definitely think that you guys should pick it up, and I definitely think that it's worth reading and worth struggling through this English edition for. Again, if you can read it in Spanish or if you can read it in Tagalog, I would recommend that you guys do that instead. But the English version is pretty good for what it is. Yeah. So that's it for now. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!